Order. I call the Secretary of State for Education to make a statement. Secretary of State Gavin Williamson.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And with permission, I'd like to make a statement regarding our plans for bringing children back to school this academic term. Dealing with this pandemic has always been an exercise in managing risk. Throughout, we have been adamant that the education of children is an absolute priority, and that keeping schools open is uppermost in all of our plans. The magnificent efforts of all the leaders, teachers and staff in all of our schools and colleges have ensured that settings are as safe and COVID secure as possible. But we must always act swiftly when circumstances change. The evidence about the new COVID variant and rising infection rates have required some immediate adjustment to our plans for the new term. This is, of course, a rapidly shifting situation, but some things remain constant. We continue to act to preserve lives and safeguard the National Health Service. And we continue to protect education by putting children first. Above all, our response is proportionate to the risk at hand and makes every use of a contingency framework that we put in place earlier this year. The latest study we have from Public Health England is that COVID infections among children are triggered by changes in the community rate. The study also says that the wider impact of school closures on children's development would be significant. I'm quite clear that we must continue to do all we can to keep children in school. Taking all these factors into account means that we have had to make a number of changes for the new term in order to help with breaking chains of transmission and to assist with keeping all of our children and our education settings as safe as we can. The fact that we have managed to do this so successfully throughout the entire pandemic is due to the incredible dedication of all our teachers, leaders and support staff, and I know that the House will join me once more in thanking them for everything that they continue to do to keep children learning as safely as possible. Accordingly, we'll be opening the majority of primary schools as planned on Monday, the 4th of January. We know how vitally important it is for younger children to be in school for their education, well-being and wider development. In a small number of areas where the infection rates are highest, we will implement our existing contingency framework, such that only vulnerable children and children of critical workers will attend face-to-face. We will publish this list of areas today on the gov.uk website. I'd like to emphasise that this is being used only as a last resort. This is not all Tier 4 areas, and that the overwhelming majority of primary schools will open as planned on Monday. The areas will also be reviewed regularly so schools can reopen at the very earliest moment. Ongoing testing for primary school staff will follow later in January, and we will be working to establish an ambitious testing programme helping to break chains of transmission and reducing the need for self-isolation where students and staff test negative for the virus. We have already announced our intention for a staggered return to education for this term for secondary-age pupils and those in colleges. Because the COVID infection rate is particularly high among this age group, we are going to allow more time so that every school and college is able to fully roll out testing for all of its pupils and staff. I would like to thank school leaders and staff for all of their ongoing work in preparing this. This kind of mass testing will help protect not just children and young people. It will benefit everyone in the community. It will break those chains of transmission that are making infection rates shoot up. This, in turn, will make it safer for more children to physically return to school. All pupils in exam years are to return during the week beginning the 11th of January, with all secondary school and college students returning full-time on the 18th of January. During the first week of term, on or after the 4th of January, secondary schools and colleges will prepare to test as many staff and students as possible and will only be open to vulnerable children and the children of key workers. The 1,500 military personnel committed to supporting schools and colleges will remain on task, providing virtual training and advice on establishing the testing process, with teams on standby to provide in-person support if required by schools. Testing will then begin the following week in earnest, with those who are in exam years at the head of the queue. This is in preparation for the full return of all pupils in all year groups on the 18th of January in most areas. To allow this focus on establishing testing throughout the first week of term, exam year groups will continue to have lessons remotely in line with what they would receive in class, and only vulnerable children and children of critical workers will have face-to-face teaching. As with primary schools, we'll be applying our existing contingency framework for education in areas of the country with very high rates of COVID infection or transmission of the virus. This will require secondary schools and colleges to offer face-to-face education to only exam years, vulnerable children and children of critical workers, with remote education being given to all of the students if they are in one of those contingency framework areas. We're also asking universities to reduce the number of students who return to campus at the start of January, prioritising students who require practical learning to gain their professional qualifications. All university students should be offered 2 rapid tests on return in order to reduce the chance of spread of COVID. To support remote education and online learning during this period, the government expects to deliver more than 50,000 devices to schools across the country on the 4th of January alone, and over 100,000 altogether during the first week of term. This is in addition to the 560,000 devices that have already been delivered, as we continue aiming for a target of over 1 million devices to be distributed for the children who need them most. This programme is now being extended to include students aged 16 to 19 in colleges and schools. So often, Mr. Speaker, we have had to close things down to try and beat this awful disease. But with schools, our best line of attack is to keep them open using mass testing tools that we now have available, so that we can ensure that children are able to continue to gain the benefit of a world-class education. As we continue to hear more encouraging news about the vaccine rollout, I am more determined than ever that children will not have to pay the price for beating COVID. Mr. Speaker, I've spoken many times of my determination that we cannot let COVID damage the life chances of an entire year of children and students. With these plans, which allow for rapid testing and a controlled return of schools, I'm confident that we can minimise the latest health risks posed by the virus, and I commend this statement to the House.
We now go up to Stratford and Elmston to the Shadow Secretary of State, Kate Green. Kate Green.
Mr. Speaker, before I begin, I'd like to place on record my thanks and the thanks of the whole Labour Party to every leader, every teacher and lecturer, the support staff, early years professionals and social workers who've moved mountains to keep children and young people safe and educated in the face of enormous odds. They deserve not just the thanks of this House, but genuine support. And I hope when he stands up again, the Secretary of State will give more information about that support. May I also thank the Secretary of State for advance sight of his statement, but the truth is we should not be in this position. Only days before many schools should have been opening again to all pupils, the Secretary of State has announced that many will not be returning as planned. This delay and disruption to children's education is a direct result of government's failure. They've lost control of the virus. Now they're losing control of children's education. The cost to pupils, the pressure on staff, and the challenges for families caused by school closures are huge. But we know that action must be taken to control the virus. So is the Secretary of State confident that the measures he's announced today will control the virus, and will he publish SAGE's advice on this issue? There is consensus across the House that the best place for children is in school, but the government's failed to give schools the support they need to make that happen. For months, Labour's been calling for mass testing in schools. The Secretary of State announced it just before schools broke up for Christmas, creating huge additional work for overstretched school staff. But just 2 weeks later, it's clear his plan has failed, and many schools will not open as planned next week. Can he tell us how many schools do now have testing infrastructure in place, and how many will have it next week and the week after? Can he guarantee that every school will have the testing it needs when due to open again? Mr. Speaker, the Secretary of State's announcement that some primary and secondary schools will not reopen to pupils in January will be a cause of huge concern to parents. Can he tell us how many primary and secondary schools will not be opening, how many pupils will be affected, and will students not in exam classes receive remote teaching while their school is closed? I'm hugely concerned that even with school open to them, the most vulnerable children may simply not attend. Can the Secretary of State tell us how he plans to keep them safely in school in the weeks ahead? I'm glad the Secretary of State announced an expansion to remote learning, but I remain concerned that it's not sufficient to support all pupils. Can he guarantee that every pupil will have the device and the connectivity that they need to learn? And will he ensure that this is available for every child whose school isn't open? Will there be any support for parents with children who can't attend school? Can he confirm that parents can be furloughed if they have childcare commitments? Can this also happen on a flexible basis that allows parents, and particularly mothers, to balance work with caring for their children? Many people who are clinically extremely vulnerable will be concerned about a return to school, whether they are vulnerable parents of a child or a vulnerable member of staff. What reassurance and support can he give to them? Mr. Speaker, it's been reported in recent days that teachers will be prioritised for vaccination, but an announcement today suggested there wouldn't be prioritisation based on occupation, and I understand the clinical priorities for the first phase of the vaccination programme. But does the Secretary of State believe that not only teachers, but all school staff, including in special schools, should be prioritised for vaccination thereafter in order to protect them and safeguard children's education? Turning to exams, Mr. Speaker, the government's failure to get a grip on the virus has caused huge disruption to pupils' education, disruption that will continue into the new year. Will the Secretary of State be making any changes to his plans to reflect this? Labour said time and again that there needs to be a credible plan B in the event of disruption continuing that means exams can't take place fairly. This is now urgent. Over 100,000 young people will be taking exams in the next few weeks in VTECs and other vocational qualifications. Can the Secretary of State tell us what he's doing to make these exams fair? The Secretary of State told us weeks ago about the expert group on learning loss, but at the time couldn't tell us who was on it, when it would sit and when it would report. Can he answer those questions today? And I welcome the decision to delay the return of students to university in January, sadly necessary for public health. Can the Secretary of State confirm he's discussed this with unions and university and student representatives? In conclusion, Mr. Speaker, we should never have been in the position we're in today. If the government had acted quicker, followed the science, and given schools the support that they needed throughout this pandemic, we wouldn't be facing a new year with this new wave of infections and huge disruption to the lives of pupils, their families, and staff across our education system. The government have lost control of the virus, and it's children and young people across the country who are paying the price.
Secretary of State.
Well, thank you ever so much, Mr. Speaker. And I do thank the Honourable Lady for echoing my words and my thanks to all teachers, leaders and all those who work in our schools, colleges and childcare settings for the wonderful work that they do. And she talks about what extra support, Madam Deputy Speaker, that we are giving those schools in terms of rolling out the largest mass testing exercise that this country has seen in terms of ensuring that children are able to get back into school and able to have the benefits of being in school. And we're supporting them not just in terms of making sure that they have the equipment that is due to be delivered to all secondary school settings on the 4th of January. We're also supporting them with extra finance, a package of £78 million in order to help them get this mass testing programme set up, established and there to test all students and all staff as they return back into secondary school. This is about taking the opportunity to be able to have a real opportunity to beat back this virus, have a real understanding of where the infection is within the community and making sure that schools are even safer than they have already been. She asks about the SAGE advice, and of course, as the Honourable Lady knows full well, that it is SAGE that publishes its advice, and it will of course publish its advice soon. The contingency framework, again, this is something that was published and has been a public document for a number of months now, so I'm sure the Honourable Lady has had the opportunity to look at it, and it makes quite clear that actually those schools that are placed in part of a contingency framework, there needs to be the continued delivery of remote education in those schools. And just to be clear, those children who are in exam group years will be returning back into secondary school, even if they're in a contingency framework area on the 11th of January. She rightly highlights the issue of vulnerable children. I think that our school system can be rightly proud, as well as our local authorities and social workers, for the amazing work that they have been doing with those children who are most vulnerable in society, to ensure that we do everything to get them attending school, making sure that they have the protection of school around them. And those efforts, working with local authorities, working with the police and working with schools, will continue. And finally, she raises the issue that there are many students who are about to take examinations in technical and vocational qualifications in the early part of January. Those assessments will continue as planned in those educational establishments that are delivering them.
Now we go to Harlow, to the Chairman of the Select Committee, Robert Halfon.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I believe that my right honourable friend wants to keep schools open and teachers and children safe. However, I have real worries about the effect of school closures, particularly hurting vulnerable children and putting enormous pressures on parents. Can I ask him to set out what risk assessment the government has made on the impact of school closures for millions of pupils on educational inequality, well-being and mental health, especially when the Royal College of Paediatricians has stated that eating disorders amongst young people has gone up by fourfold, partly because of school closures and social isolation? Will the department introduce a tracker on individual pupils, at least those in exam years, working with schools and local authorities to ensure that those at home get the learning they need? And will he ensure that teachers and support staff get priority for vaccinations so we can get our schools open again soon? And finally, will he thank teachers and support staff in my constituency of Harlow who are doing all they can to keep children learning?
Well, I would very much like to join my right honourable friend in thanking the teachers and support staff who've done so much in his constituency of Harlow to keep children learning. And the importance of school is the reason why that we're continuing to proceed with opening all primary schools on the 4th of January. The importance of education means that this is why we're rolling out the mass testing regime to ensure that secondary school students across the majority of the country are going to be able to be returning back into school. We know how important it is. Children need to be in school, and that is why we'll always do everything we can do to resist knee-jerk reactions to close schools or colleges, because we recognise how important it is for children's life chances for them to be in schools. My right honourable friend raises the important issue of impact of lost learning, Madam Deputy Speaker. That is why we commissioned EPI and Renaissance to do a close study on lost learning, and we'll be looking particularly closely at the impact, especially among exam year cohorts, as well as the wider school population, to make sure that that is there to inform us on any future policy decisions.
And we go to Glasgow to Carol Monaghan.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker, and I thank the Secretary of State for advance sight of his statement. And I'd like to join others in recognising the work that our teachers and school staff are carrying out in some very challenging circumstances. And I do hope they're managing to get some well-deserved rest over the Christmas break. This new COVID strain means it's difficult to make concrete decisions and commitments for the future. But the problem is that the Secretary of State is once again making last-minute decisions that leave schools with absolutely no time to plan. So firstly, can the Secretary of State outline how his actions align with the advice received from SAGE? Ongoing testing for school staff is welcome. However, anyone that's spent any time in either primary or secondary schools will know that these are busy, often tightly packed environments. And according to Professor Neil Ferguson, this new strain hints at a higher propensity to infect children. So we're asking teachers, some with underlying health conditions, to work in this potentially risky environment. NHS and frontline care staff must, of course, be prioritised for the vaccine, but following these groups, will he ensure that teachers are a priority for vaccine? None of us want a return. Apologies, Madam Deputy Speaker, I can't hear you here. Can I finish off by saying there is a massive difference between posting activities online and actual live online teaching and learning with real-time interactions between a teacher and their class. So what steps is he taking to ensure that schools have the capacity and bandwidth to deliver proper online learning? And will the Secretary of State accept that he may need to amend his current strategy if the need should arise?
Secretary of State.
Well, I thank the Honourable Lady, the Honourable Member for Glasgow North West, for her comments, and recognising the fact that we are in a situation that is rapidly changing, and we do sometimes have to adapt our responses as a result of a changing coronavirus. And I know that there's been similar challenges faced within the Scottish Government as has been faced within the UK Government as well. We do recognise the fact that this new strain means that we have to take a different approach, and that is why we've moved from saying that the mass testing regime that we're rolling out within secondary schools has to move from being something that was optional and an offer to schools, but something that we're requiring schools to do. Because schools are a unique environment, it's important that we put as many protections in place. And like her, I want to see all teachers be very much right up there to be in the best possible position to be vaccinated, so they can carry on the incredibly important work of keeping children in education. And I'm incredibly pleased that we are in a position to ensure that primary schools are opening on the 4th of January. Secondary schools are going to be welcoming back children from in those exam cohorts on the 11th of January, as well as all other pupils on the 18th of January.
James Cartledge.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. It's obviously been fantastic news today that we've heard about the Oxford AstraZeneca vaccine. So can I join with the previous two questions, including from my honourable friend, the Chairman of the Select Committee, to urge my right honourable friend to do what he can within current policy to ensure that teachers are prioritised for the vaccine? Does he not agree that were we to vaccinate as many teachers as possible, as soon as possible, this would not only make schools safer and boost teacher morale, but actually would reduce part of the pressure on closing schools in the first place?
Well, I often agree with my honourable friend, and I don't disagree with him on this occasion. Now, obviously, the decision in terms of vaccination has to be prioritised across a whole raft of areas, but the key thing is those people who are most clinically vulnerable. But as we get through that stage of clinical need, I would certainly hope that we would be able to look at how we can use vaccinations for those who are in the teaching profession and who support education.
Now we go to St Albans, to Daisy Cooper.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. We are in a race against time to stop a new catastrophe of educational inequality. Some children have lost more than 6 months of learning. Some schools still can't access the COVID workforce budget because of absurd criteria. It is shocking that only half of digital devices have been delivered and that mass testing is only being rolled out 4 months after schools returned. So when will the Secretary of State give schools the rota powers, the funding, the devices and the trust that they need and deserve to stay open safely?
Well, thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. We had announced the additional £78 million worth of funding just before the Christmas period in order to help and assist them in the rollout of mass testing regime in all secondary schools. We actually only announced the distribution of an extra 500,000 devices on the 500,000 that had already been distributed just the other week. And if she had listened to my statement, she would have actually heard that we're planning to distribute 50,000 on the 4th of January and another 100,000 over the following week. But I'm sure she'll at some point maybe look at my statement in detail and pay attention to it.
Now we go to Dudley, to Mike Wood.
And my children are in the next room paying rather more attention than is usual to the House's proceedings this afternoon. But what steps is my right honourable friend taking to help schools and colleges to take up the offer that the government has made to provide rapid testing, which would be so vital in helping to keep children, teachers and indeed parents safe?
Secretary of State.
Well, I think my honourable friend makes an important point. This isn't just about helping schools. It's not just about helping pupils and that workforce within the schools, but it's helping the families with school-aged children. It's helping the whole community push back the tide of this virus, because we'll be testing more people as a result of this than ever before, literally testing millions of children every single week. And yes, we recognise that schools need that extra support. That's why that we created the fund of £78 million in order to be able to support them. And we've shared that information with schools the other week as to how much money that they'll be eligible to get. But we do understand that there'll be some schools that have unique problems or challenges in rolling out this mass testing, and that's why I'm incredibly grateful to Her Majesty's Armed Forces for making themselves available, as well as Ofsted, in supporting schools who are having challenges in rolling out the mass testing programme to ensure that it is implemented in all secondary schools and all colleges, because this will benefit everyone within school, everyone in college and everyone within the community.
Now we go to Warwick and Leamington, to Matt Western.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Like so many frontline workers, teaching staff are deeply committed to their profession, but they've also been among the most vulnerable, particularly given it has been amongst the 12 to 17-year-olds that have been a major vector for transmission. I spoke with head teachers just before Christmas, and they were left angered by the government's late announcement to introduce testing without any support and little direction. And today we hear there will be a delay to schools reopening. So can I ask the Secretary of State just 2 points? As I asked him back in November, will he prioritise frontline teaching staff for vaccinations, given the political will to keep schools and colleges open as much as possible? And secondly, given that so many students will be taking BTECs and other technical and vocational qualifications exams in the next few weeks, what support the government will be providing to those students and the staff assisting them?
Well, the Honourable Member for Warwick and Leamington is right to highlight the issue of those children taking BTEC qualifications, and we made the decision about the importance of those youngsters being able to continue to take those qualifications over the coming weeks. In terms of vaccination, and he's picked up on the thread raised by previous questioners, obviously as Education Secretary it isn't within my remit to determine as to who will be receiving the vaccinations, but I would certainly hope that when we are through that process of working through those groups who are most vulnerable to COVID, then those who are working in our education settings are looked at in the most positive way to ensure that they are high up on the list of receiving those vaccinations.
Now we go to Newcastle, to Aaron Bell.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. And can I join the Education Secretary in paying tribute to all those working in schools in these difficult times. I welcome his statement and the announcement that all secondary school and college students will receive 2 rapid tests at the start of the new term to identify asymptomatic cases. But I know this as a father myself, it's the self-isolation that's caused such disruption for teachers, students and pupils. So can he confirm that it's his intention to use rapid testing of staff and students who've come into contact with confirmed cases to help reduce the need for self-isolation? And will this be available daily if necessary?
I can absolutely confirm to my honourable friend that that will be available to both students and staff members in secondary school settings, and how important it is. This means that we'll be in a position to reduce the number of children and teachers who are having to self-isolate, and it means that it will be easier for education settings to fully work as normally as possible, but most importantly, students to be in a position to maximise the amount of time that they spend studying.
Now we go to Pontefract and Castleford, to Yvette Cooper.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Pontefract New College is currently having to organise the mass testing for twice weekly for 2,500 sixth formers, but they've had no allocation of funding, no contact from the military. They're having to find additional staff, and they have no space in order to do these tests as well. Why has the government not given schools and colleges a clear allocation of funding that will cover additional staff, that will cover DBS checks, that will cover the practicalities of delivering this mass testing? They all want to do this mass testing, but frankly, the support that they are getting from the ministers and the education department is always too late, always too chaotic, and frankly, isn't giving them the support they need to keep children safely in education.
Well, I'll certainly make sure the information is passed on to the Right Honourable Member. It was published before Christmas and was available to colleges and schools, but I'll make sure that my private office forwards it on to her and where they can get that information, because it is readily available and should hopefully be of assistance in her duties as a constituency Member of Parliament.
Felicity Buchan.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I'd like to pay tribute to all of the teachers in Kensington and Chelsea who have been heroic in their efforts to keep schools open, even with very high case rates in London. Can my right honourable friend clarify whether London will be part of the contingency framework? And also, he mentioned, I believe, a 2-week delay. Can he clarify whether schools will definitely reopen after 2 weeks or whether there will be a review at that point?
Secretary of State.
My honourable friend is right to ask that question, and after the 2-week period there would be a review. Our obvious hope and desire is to see that those areas that are in the contingency framework to be moving out of that, but we'll obviously be guided by the public health advice and the scientific advice that is available to us. It's very important that these decisions aren't made on a regional basis but on a local basis, because at every stage I want to see the maximum number of children in school, and that sweeping decisions aren't made and we minimise the disruption to children, to schools and to parents as much as possible.
Now we go to North Durham, to Kevin Jones.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. It was disappointing that the Secretary of State didn't make a statement to the House before the Christmas recess, and that mixed messages across Christmas from his department has led to much anxiety amongst parents, teachers and students. I doubt whether his statement today is going to reassure many of them. Can I ask on testing what the role of local directors of public health are going to be? And also, who is going to support individual schools and colleges? Because 1,500 army personnel are not going to be enough to fill that task. And also, more importantly, what will happen to the data that is collected from this testing? Without a comprehensive, locally based plan, is in danger of making all the same mistakes that we've seen in terms of the national test and trace system. Can the government not wake up to the fact that local plans need to be put in place, not dictated from nationally? They will not work.
Well, the Right Honourable Gentleman raises an important point about how vital it is to work with local directors of public health, local authorities, and we believe that this will be an enormous assistance to those local authorities of identifying where more COVID cases are. This will be an opportunity to deliver more rapid testing, not just within County Durham, but right across the country than has actually so far been delivered before. And the Honourable Gentleman may have heard that extra support is being provided to schools and colleges in order to be able to stand up this testing. We are in areas and where schools and colleges have particular problems. We will look at supporting them with a team in order to help get this mass testing up and established. And in terms of the data that is being collected, of course, this is vitally important. So those youngsters who are in a situation who test positive as a result of taking a lateral flow test, that data will be fed immediately into the test and trace system, which of course is shared with local authorities as well.
And now we go to Romsey and Southampton North. Caroline Noakes.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Teachers, parents and pupils all need certainty. They need to be able to plan the return to school, prepare for exams if they are going to happen, and they need to know whether they might need additional childcare. I commend my right honourable friend for his ability to make changes when required, but please can he assure my constituents that this is the plan that is going to stick, and it's going to give all of them the certainty that they are desperately calling out for.
Well, I certainly hope it does give them confidence, knowing that primary schools in her constituency of Romsey are going to be opening on Monday. Give her the confidence that exam year groups are going to be returning into secondary school, into colleges on the 11th of January, and all year groups will be returning shortly after that.
And we go to Bristol South, to Karen Smith.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. The Secretary of State has just said that we can be confident about what's happening next week. But frankly, as a parent, as a legislator, I have no confidence in what the Secretary of State has just said. In fact, I am none the wiser after his statement, having heard from experts in health privately this afternoon. Parents have got one question for the Secretary of State. How will we know when we send our kids back to school next week or the week after that it is safe to do so?
Well, what we have seen consistently ever since the start of June is that millions of children have safely returned to school, down and thanks to the amazing efforts of so many teaching staff and support staff, creating safe and secure environments for them to be able to learn in and also for others to work in. But we do recognise with this new strain, we have to go that bit further, so much further. And that is why we're introducing this mass testing scheme, the largest that this country has ever seen, to give parents, to give those who work in secondary schools, extra confidence and extra belief that it is safe for those children to return, but also to help all of those who are engaged in this battle against COVID to be able to root out this disease and make sure those who unfortunately are infected by it are able to know that they're infected by it and are able to self-isolate.
Now we go to Starbridge, to Suzanne Webb.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Now, I stand steadfast behind the government in its determination to protect young people's education, and ministers are right when they say it is a national priority. Now, there is a theme to my questions today, and rightly so, as we end what has been a difficult and challenging year for those working on the front line. Will my right honourable friend join me in thanking all those who work in schools in my constituency, from teaching assistants, teachers, the heads of department, heads of schools, those who transport children to school, to those who keep the schools clean and safe, to those in schools who have fed and watered our children, often going above and beyond, doing their utmost to protect our children's education and keep our schools open. We owe them a debt of gratitude.
Well, I would certainly like to join my honourable friend and constituency neighbour in thanking all of those who are working in education settings right across Starbridge and, of course, right across the country. And, of course, many children in my constituency benefit through travelling into Starbridge to benefit from some of the brilliant schools that are provided in her constituency. Teachers, support staff have done an amazing job. And, yes, it is true to say that we are asking even more of them, Madam Deputy Speaker. But the reason we're asking them to do more, because we realise and understand how vitally important it is to do absolutely everything possible to keep schools open and ensure children continue to benefit from the education we want to see every child get.
Meg Hillier.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. We all know, as the Secretary of State said, that children benefit by being in school, and we've seen the gap between those from the richest and the poorest households widen during COVID. His permanent secretary put great store on the tutoring programme when she appeared before the Public Accounts Committee nearly 2 weeks ago. But could you give us an update on that, but also about the steering group in his department that's looking seriously at this issue, at the impact on those more vulnerable pupils, and can he be precise about what he's doing so that gap, which has been narrowing massively in my constituency and some of my excellent schools, isn't going to stay wide and get wider still as we go through and come out of the other side of the pandemic?
She is right to talk passionately about the brilliant schools in her constituency, who we've seen a transformation in schools in London as a result of reforms that were introduced both by this government and changes that were made in the latter part of the last Labour government. And we've seen education as an incredibly powerful tool in terms of closing that attainment gap and that disadvantage gap, and London has been one of those real powers in sort of driving that forward. The National Tutoring Programme is sort of rolling out very much as planned, and actually we're very pleased with the rollout. We want to see part of a spending review, and I'm sure the Honourable Lady will notice we've wanted to have the opportunity of seeing this as not something that just happened for 1 year, but actually happened over multiple years, because we believe that is where the real benefit is going to be had. But I must confess, and I'm a little bit old-fashioned on this, I will constantly do everything I can do, whether it's in her constituency or whether it's in my constituency, to do everything and take quite sort of extraordinary measures to keep schools open wherever it is absolutely possible to do so. And if they do have to close, to make sure that that closure is for the absolute minimum of time, because we do see children suffering as a result of isolation. And I know from both of my children have had to sadly self-isolate as a result of being in contact with other children with COVID. And it's really important, whether it's the National Tutoring Programme, whether it's the COVID Catch-up Fund, but whether it is the continued reforms that we've had in education that have driven up standards so much in her constituency and my constituency. We mustn't lose sight that these reforms have to carry on to continue to drive standards and reduce that attainment gap.
Now we go to Rushcliffe. Ruth Edwards.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I've been contacted by school leaders who've highlighted their need to get clarity over future changes to school opening arrangements as quickly as possible. Would my right honourable friend consider a suggestion from one deputy head in my constituency? Publishing the real-time data that influences these decisions via an online dashboard similar to the one published by the Department for Health and Social Care, so that schools would have as much time as possible to plan? And would he meet with me and my constituent to discuss this in more detail?
Well, we'd certainly always be more than happy to sort of look at different ways of being able to share as much information as possible with schools and communities about what best informs decisions. The Minister for School Standards, as I just about to leap to my feet, immediately wanted to meet with my honourable friend and her constituent, so I know that he will be organising that swiftly in order to be able to listen in greater detail about the thoughts and ideas, but also not just about the current challenges that schools face, but also how we can continue to drive our reforms and improvements within the school system, not just this year, but for decades into the future.
Now we go to Manchester, to Lucy Powell.
Thank you very much, Deputy Speaker. Finally, the Secretary of State has come to Parliament to address the issues that have been swirling around everywhere over Christmas, which began with him ordering schools to go online for the first week of term on the last day of term, having taken legal action against councils that wanted to do the same thing only 3 days earlier. And today he tells us that some primary schools won't open, but he hasn't actually published the list of those schools. This really now is a catalogue of incompetence from this Secretary of State. But after months of asking, he still hasn't answered the critical question of how the differential impact of missing school will be addressed, especially for the most disadvantaged. No word on how exams this year can proceed on a level playing field. So if the test of his legacy is the attainment gap, I'm afraid it's one he's going to totally fail.
Well, it's always lovely to hear from the Honourable Lady, and sort of with such a festive backdrop behind her. I mean, the Honourable Lady, frankly, whatever you do, will probably always be a little bit miserable about everything. We put a £1 billion COVID catch-up fund, making sure we're supporting the children from the most disadvantaged backgrounds. We go above and beyond at every stage to ensure that children from the most disadvantaged backgrounds are given the most assistance. And we, on this side of the House, have always understood that by actually preserving education, by making sure that children are in the position to be able to return to school at the earliest possible moment, be able to benefit from being in school. That is the best way of giving them the greatest advantages in life. And I know the Honourable Lady, it's not within her DNA in order to be able to give credit to any government. I'm not sure whether it be £1 billion, £2 billion or £3 billion in order for her to acknowledge the fact that we are taking action.
And now we go to Amber Valley, to Nigel Mills.
Thank you, and I welcome the showing at this stage. Given that Amber Valley, as a local authority area, has some of the higher levels of cases in the country, could he confirm whether we are in the contingency area where schools won't be allowed to open at all? And if, and I hope that we're not, would he publish what the criteria are for deciding which areas schools can't open?
We will be publishing the details of those local authorities within contingency framework areas later on today on the gov.uk website. But we would want to see schools entering the contingency framework very much as an absolute last resort, where the public health evidence and the public health advice is that it is important to do so and vital to do so in terms of the management of COVID infections.
Now we go to York, to Rachel Maskell.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. This academic year has been significantly disrupted. It's clear that for many children, they've missed significant portions of their education, whilst others have missed none, resulting in major inequalities. And of course, disruption is getting worse. Not if, but when will he announce an alternative plan to end-of-year assessments beyond his exam plan? And will he publish a full equality impact assessment on all end-of-year options so that we can see which will be the fairest?
Well, we all, I think, recognise that this has been an incredibly challenging year for all students, and we've seen it on the impact on our own children and, of course, on the impact of children within our constituency. But you know, as those who have been involved in education recognise that exams are the fairest and the best form of assessment. But we do recognise this is a unique year. It has presented unique challenges, and that's why we've taken the unusual and unique steps in terms of ensuring that the generosity of grading is similar to that and mirrors that of those children who took exams in the previous year, but also taking the action to make sure that there is the advance notice on the areas that children are going to be tested on, to make sure that they're in the best possible position to succeed and do the very best they possibly can do in those exams.
Now we go to Essex, to Stephen Metcalfe.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Can I thank my right honourable friend for his statement and for adopting a pragmatic approach to a changing situation. And can I also thank all the schools locally, many of whom have been open and welcoming students throughout this pandemic. However, if all schools are not and students are not going to return to school as expected, I'm concerned that students, particularly from less well-off backgrounds, that they will miss out on their education. Can he therefore confirm what extra support he and the government will give to move to quality remote learning and maintain it for as long as it is needed?
Well, my honourable friend will be aware that what I want to see is all children in schools at all times, if and that is possible. But he does highlight there will be certain areas of the country where additional action needs to be taken, which will lead to the temporary closure of schools. This has happened across the country all the way through this pandemic, but we'll probably see a little more of it over the coming term than we saw in the previous term. This is part of the reason why we made the announcement of the distribution of 1 million laptops to support remote learning in schools. That is why we have made and continue to make the increased investment in the Oak National Academy to support online learning and making sure there's a whole suite of lessons for every subject and every year group to support school as an important resource in order for them to be able to teach their children. And that support will continue, as well as the COVID catch-up fund of £1 billion that has been made available to schools and colleges.
Order, we still have a lot of business to get through today, and I appreciate it's more difficult when people are participating virtually for them to work out just how long they are taking in asking a question. Can I just remind members that a question should be a question. It isn't a speech, it's just a question. And if we have short questions, I know the Secretary of State will be able to give short answers. We will go to Denton and Reddish, to Andrew Gwynn.
Thank you. Greater Manchester has been under restrictions since the end of July. Many areas got the virus right down, only for rates to spike again when the schools, colleges and universities went back. What happened in the autumn term didn't work. It was too disruptive for too many. What guarantee can he give the House that this won't happen again? And where schools are closed, will he guarantee that all students will have the laptops and digital access required to learn remotely? Because not all did last time.
Well, in tribute to you, Madam Deputy Speaker, I'll be very brief to the Honourable Member for Denton and Reddish. You probably heard in my earlier response that we are rolling out the distribution of 1 million laptops. Over 150,000 of those laptops are going to be going out over the first couple of weeks of the coming term. And actually, the measures that we have seen saw that actually 99% of schools were able to open. We had excellent attendance of schools right across the country, including areas with high infection rates, and areas with high infection rates were able to maintain schools being open. And the measures that we're taking in terms of a mass testing regime will ensure that schools can continue to remain open, a fact that I'm sure the Honourable Gentleman will celebrate.
Jonathan Gullis.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker, and I want to thank all the teachers and support staff across Stoke-on-Trent, North, Kidsgrove and Tork, and I welcome my right honourable friend's commitment to mass testing. My main concerns, however, remain around children, particularly those in disadvantaged homes, with the work with catching up and how the National Tutoring Programme is helping students in Stoke-on-Trent, North, Kidsgrove and Tork to catch up, but also about the idea of how we can use alternatives to just the Oak National Academy, which is online, and will my right honourable friends be speaking to textbook publishers to see if they will be willing, at cost price, to send out textbooks to some of our most vulnerable children, enabling them to sit their exams this year?
I certainly think, as my honourable friend so often does, has brilliant ideas, and I'd be very happy to sit down with my honourable friend to sort of look at how we could sort of do that. I know that the Minister for School Standards is one of the greatest advocates of textbooks in this country, and the real impact and the real support they offer students in terms of their learning. So we can sit down and discuss his thoughts and ideas.
So we now go to Ealing and Acton, to Dr. Rupa Haq.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. All teachers want rapid testing, but at a time that they feel exposed and scared with the new variant. I mean, 80% of my schools have cases anyway. Could he develop stronger guidance in partnership with the profession rather than seeing them as a unionised enemy to spring last-minute changes on? And for the head of a convent I spoke to, desperate to roll out testing, could he provide any funding? They operate on tight margins, but as it's an independent, she has been told there is none.
While we are not in a position to be able to provide independent schools with funding to roll out testing. We are providing them with all the facilities, the testing equipment and all the other additional equipment that is required to do the full testing regime. That's been provided to all schools and all settings which are teaching and providing education facilities for all those children of years 7 and above.
Now we go to Aylesbury to Rob Butler.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. My right honourable friend has been consistent throughout this crisis in insisting we balance the need to keep people safe and the vital need for children to continue their education. So, in light of that, can he reassure parents of primary school children in Tier 4 areas such as Aylesbury that he has fully considered the safety of both pupils and staff in reaching his decision that those primary schools can indeed reopen next week and continue their very valuable education?
At every stage, as my honourable friend will recognise, is the safety of pupils and those who work in schools is at the very heart of every decision that we make. And we all recognise the impact of children not being in school as to what that has in terms of their life chances. So it is always important to balance the need to get children in, but making sure they're in a safe environment. And this is why I think the measures that we're taking in terms of testing go so far to ensure that children not only get the benefit of that brilliant education, but they also have the surety and the confidence of knowing they're going into a safe and secure environment.
We now go to Weaver Vale to Mike Amesbury.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Surely, given that Cheshire West and Chester has now been put into Tier 4, we do require an update from the Secretary of State whether schools are going to be, the primary schools are going to be reopening on Monday. And surely staff, teaching staff should be prioritised for the vaccine. It just would make sense.
Well, I can assure the honourable gentleman that schools in Cheshire West and Chester primary schools will be open on Monday, yes.
And now we go to Meon Valley to Flick Drummond.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. And can I join with the previous questioner and ask my right honourable friend if he agrees that the best way to get schools back working properly would be to prioritise vaccines for both teachers and pupils who may be spreading the virus asymptomatically? And can he urge the Department of Health to prioritise this?
So I would certainly urge the Department for Health in order to prioritise, the vaccination of those who work in schools. All the vaccines that are currently available as yet haven't had clinical trials or completed clinical trials on people under the age of 18. So obviously, I'm sure my honourable friend would recognise that it would be absolutely imperative that those trials were completed before we were in a position to be able to roll out any vaccination programme to those younger cohorts.
Clive Efford.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I hope if Greenwich schools are included in one of these contingency areas, that the Secretary of State is going to have the decency to apologise to parents in our borough. And with that in mind, if mass testing shows up that large numbers of children in schools have infection rates, what's the contingency plan then, apart from mass disruption to children's education just continuing into the future? Surely the end of this has got to be some form of vaccination in schools when it's available. And is he planning for that when it can be done?
Well, I'm not sure if the honourable gentleman heard my comments to the previous question, but none of the vaccines, as I understand it, have had fully done trials on children under the age of 18. So it wouldn't be obviously ethical to do vaccinations on children until that had been fully trialled.
Martin Vickers.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I should first declare an interest in that my daughter is a teacher. I agree with the approach the Secretary of State has outlined today, and in a constantly changing situation, it is a sensible approach. But can I return to the issue of vaccinations for teachers and staff? Clearly, in Tier 3 and 4 areas in particular, it would be valuable, and coupled with the testing regime, would give both teachers and parents the confidence that is needed. I accept, as he said earlier, it's not within his remit, but I urge him to press his colleagues in government to look again at this.
I can absolutely confirm with my honourable friend that I will take his pressing on me to press others in order to do that. I know how important it is, and I know what a heroic job that so many within our schools have been doing to ensure we have that continuity of education for all our children.
Kim Johnson.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Pupils in Liverpool Riverside have suffered disproportionate learning loss, and we've heard the rhetoric on how this government is levelling up, but it's time to move from the rhetoric to the reality. How many of the thousands of laptops have made it to those in greatest need, and has this been monitored? The National Tutoring Programme is projected to only reach just 1 in 6 pupils on free school meals. And will the Minister join me in thanking and supporting all education and support staff in Liverpool Riverside constituency who have gone above and beyond since the first lockdown to support both children and our community throughout this pandemic? Thank you.
Well, I would very much like to join with the honourable member in thanking all of those within the Liverpool Riverside constituency who have actually done so much to ensure the continuity of education for so many children. And of course, the great city of Liverpool was one of those areas that have experienced very high infection rates, and actually those teaching staff, those communities making sure that schools stayed open and children were able to get the benefit of education is a real testament to the hard work of so many of the teaching profession. Madam Deputy Speaker, over 500,000 of those laptops have already been distributed to children from the most disadvantaged background. Many hundreds of thousands and more are going to be distributed over the coming weeks. That will benefit her constituents, my constituents, and all of our constituents.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Those due to sit their A-levels and GCSEs in 2021 have suffered far more disruption and continue to do so than those who were due to sit them earlier this year. Will the Secretary of State accept that the only sensible and fair course of action is to cancel these exams too, to ensure that those students' future prospects are not damaged by taking exams which will have been rendered virtually meaningless?
Well, Madam Deputy Speaker, this is why we took the action that we did in terms of making sure that the generosity of grading mirrors that of 2020. This is why we announced the advance notice of exam subjects, so both teachers and students in the final months, in the run-up to their exams, are able to focus on the topics and areas that are going to be in the exams. We do believe that unless it's exceptional circumstances, that exams is the fairest and best form of assessment, and all the evidence points out that actually children from the most disadvantaged backgrounds and children from black and ethnic minority communities are most disadvantaged when there is non-exam assessment, and are given the greatest advantage when they sit exams.
Ruth Cadbury.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Head teachers of primary schools, of all schools, are willing and able to be partners in this, in ensuring our children get a proper education. But the Secretary of State has said that some primary schools won't open next week. What will be the criteria for those schools not opening? And when will those head teachers of those schools be given the courtesy of being given an advance warning and be treated with respect by the Secretary of State?
I'm sure the honourable member for Brentford is aware of the Gold Command that is chaired by the Health Secretary that looks at all the decisions in terms of tiering and other measures that need to be taken in order to deal with this pandemic. And it is as part of that health structure that those decisions will be made, and they will be made jointly between, working with the Health Secretary and myself, as the powers to close sit with myself as Education Secretary. The Honourable Lady will probably be familiar with the gov.uk website and the notice of those areas that are going to be put in the contingency framework. The details of that are published on that website currently.
Sir David Amos.
Welcoming my right honourable friend's statement, would he join me in thanking all education providers in Southend West for their heroic efforts during the coronavirus pandemic, but most importantly, when they return to school, can I ask him to make sure that there is clarity in a practical sense regarding testing and for the arrangements for their summer examinations?
Well, I thank my honourable friend, the member for Southend West, for raising the wonderful work that educators and teachers and support staff have done in providing that Rolls-Royce education that we want all children to benefit from. We have already published considerable guidance and support for schools as they roll out mass testing. We've also published the information about the funding that they're able to receive so that they're able to properly budget and provision for the type of support that they need in order to be able to roll out the mass testing in their schools. But in those schools, and I hope it's a small number of schools, that have particular problems in establishing a testing regime, the Armed Forces have very kindly stepped forward, along with Ofsted, to be there to provide that support, to get that established in those exceptional circumstances where schools and colleges are having real problems.
Ian Byrne.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. And may I thank the Secretary of State for his kind words about the educators, teachers in Liverpool who've done such an outstanding job. We have hundreds of thousands of working class children educated in the state system who are facing exams in complete despair. Inequality of opportunity for these children is due to the ineptitude of the government's response, including a lack of resource allocation and a complete failure to listen to teachers' concerns. Will the Secretary of State meet with myself and head teachers in Liverpool West Derby as soon as possible to discuss the resources and measures that are urgently needed from this government?
Well, very much we always do listen to what the teaching profession says, and we take the actions and the advice and the guidance that do. This is what crafted our response in terms of the creation of the COVID Catch-up Fund and the National Tutoring Programme. Responses are very much aimed at targeting children from the most disadvantaged backgrounds, and my right honourable friend, the Minister for School Standards, has said he would be absolutely delighted and look forward to meeting with yourself and, of course, the wonderful professionals within your constituency who are so committed and dedicated to delivering the very best education for every one of the children in Liverpool West Derby.
Will Ragg.
Thank you very much, Madam Speaker. And can I thank my right honourable friend for his statement and recognise the invidious choices he has to make as Secretary of State. And can I also thank all of the teachers and in particular the leaders of those schools in the Hazel Grove constituency for their hard work over the Christmas holidays to prepare for mass testing upon the return. But can I ask my right honourable friend who thinks it's somewhat ironic that later on today's order paper there is a motion to extend the adjournment of this House to the 11th of January. What message does that send to our schools?
Well, Madam Deputy Speaker, I'd certainly like to join with my honourable friend in thanking the teachers and support staff within Hazel Grove for all the work that they do. We all recognise that we are placing great burdens on so many public servants, and our job as a department is to give them as much support as possible. As a former Chief Whip, I think it's always best not to always be focused on the department and job that you have, and that is why my focus is on education and schools.
Justin Matters.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. According to Sutton Trust research, 15% of teachers reported that a third of their students do not have adequate facilities to learn remotely from home. And whilst I accept some attempts have been made to rectify that, there's still too many pupils unable to learn online. So can the Secretary of State tell us, in terms of the schools that are not reopening next month, how many pupils in those schools do not currently have access to online learning?
Aylesmere, Port and Eston's right to point out to the fact that the best place for children to learn is in school, and that is why we have been, at every stage, driven as hard as possible to ensure schools are open and that they remain open, and that is why we're taking the action we are, whether it is the mass testing regime, whether it is the fact that primary schools are going to be opening up on the 4th of January, because we realise the best place for them to be is in school. We have looked at some of the needs that schools have in terms of additional laptop and digital equipment. That is why we've expanded the provision that was originally 200,000 to over 1 million laptops, and as I touched on earlier, that distribution of additional laptops is currently ongoing and will continue to happen over the coming weeks.
Sir David Evanet.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I welcome my right honourable friend's flexibility and pragmatic approach at this difficult time, and also his determination to keep schools open. I should like to praise all the teachers in my borough of Bexley for their commitment and hard work. However, as a strong supporter of social mobility, I'm naturally concerned about the effect on the education of our most disadvantaged children during this coronavirus pandemic. Can he confirm that the additional financial support that he's given will help prevent them from being left behind in their education?
Well, I thank my right honourable friend for highlighting the thing that both he and I care so passionately about, is ensuring that children from the most disadvantaged backgrounds are not left behind. And that is why the National Tutoring Programme, that is why the COVID Catch-up Fund is so vital, not just for his constituents, but for my constituents and all of our constituents from those most disadvantaged communities. We recognise that this pandemic has impacted every community up and down the country, and it's so vital we do everything we can do to get them back on their feet, learning and closing that gap once more.
Karen Buck.
If I may continue the theme of resources for home-based learning, we know it is less satisfactory than children being at school, but it is infinitely better than nothing. Unfortunately, 9 months into the pandemic, only 700 laptops were distributed in my borough, despite there being 5,000 children on free school meals. Can the Secretary of State explain why it has taken so long to make sure there is adequate access to laptops? And if he can also advise everybody how many children in each constituency are deemed to be in need of capacity for home-based learning, so that we are able to assess just how effective the distribution of laptops has been.
I'd certainly happily provide the latest information in terms of distribution of laptops in her constituency. The reason that we announced the uplift to the distribution of 1 million laptops is we recognise that actually the challenges of the pandemic and do mean that we need to give more in terms of digital provision, and that's why we took the move to increase it from 500,000 to 1 million.
Dr. Julian Lewis.
This feels slightly like my own first day back at school, Madam Deputy Speaker, though rather near the bottom of this particular class. Would my right honourable friend agree that the importance of his mass testing programme for schools derives from the danger that infected children may be spreaders without symptoms?
Well, I'm sure, I think if he is a new boy back in school, the chief whip is probably the headmaster, so he'll probably be keeping a close eye on my right honourable friend. But it is good to see him back with Conservative whip, as I very much felt very privileged to work so closely with him when he was chairman of the Defence Select Committee and when I was in a previous role. He's right that actually there are many children who do have coronavirus who don't exhibit symptoms of having coronavirus. And this is why the move to mass testing in secondary schools is so important, because it gives us the opportunity to identify so many more children who have the virus that just don't know it. And that means that so many more households will be able to be informed that they also need to be tested, as they may also have the virus. This is an important step in terms of defeating this virus and taking the battle to COVID to ensure that actually we defeat it and we're triumphant in doing so.
Janet Davey.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Testing of the virus is key to supporting a child to stay in school. And when children are not in school, the child's learning is disrupted. It causes a lot of anxiety to family plans and affects the ability for the adult or adults in the home to work. Can the Secretary of State confidently say to my constituents and to parents that schools will have adequate testing infrastructure and support in place for pupils and staff when both primary and secondary schools reopen? And does he agree the vaccine should be prioritised for all staff working in education?
Thank the honourable lady for her question, and she absolutely assure her that the rollout of mass testing in secondary schools is properly supported. Schools will be getting the first batch of both equipment and tests on the 4th of January, and this has been distributed right across the country, with additional tests very rapidly following up to ensure that all pupils and all staff within schools can be tested. As I touched upon in my statement, we're also looking at rolling out the testing mechanism and the screen testing and the serial testing for staff in primary schools. As I'm sure the honourable lady will appreciate, that the ability to deliver testing in primary schools does present some challenges in terms of pupils in primary school because of their age and their not necessarily being able to do it themselves. But when we're in a position to go further on testing, when home tests are going to be able to be distributed, we'd look at expanding the role of mass testing in schools even further than we currently have it.
Jason McCartney.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I'd just like to thank all the wonderful teachers and support staff across my Colne Valley constituency, and also welcome plans for all secondary and college students to receive 2 rapid tests at the start of term. Now, the Royal Air Force have already been helping deliver these rapid tests across Kirklees as part of mass community testing. So has the Secretary of State considered using military support like this on the ground in schools and colleges to help deliver these mass rapid tests and help take the pressure off some of our teachers, having done such a wonderful job under extreme circumstances the past few months?
Well, as I'd very much join my honourable friend, and I know he served in the Royal Air Force for a number of years, so has a particular fondness for our armed forces, as we all do. The armed forces have done an amazing job. We do believe, if you just look at the sheer number of schools across the country and the whole workforce within schools across the country, we felt that it wouldn't be right or proper to ask the armed forces to deliver testing in every single one of our secondary schools. That's why we provided the extra additional financial support for schools in order for them to be able to deliver on the mass testing regime. But we're very fortunate that my right honourable friend, the Secretary of State for Defence, has agreed a military aid for civilian authorities request that means that we are able to provide military support to those schools who are really struggling in terms of setting up the testing regime. But we believe when these are set up, they'll be in an excellent position to be able to keep on running and have a real impact in driving down the coronavirus infection rates in his constituency and all of our constituencies.
And finally, Matt Rodder.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I would also like to pay tribute to both schools, teachers, support staff and young people in my constituency for the incredibly effective way that they responded to the coronavirus crisis during the autumn. However, as the Secretary of State knows, the pressures on schools in Tier 4 areas are significant and they're growing all the time. Will he now commit to reviewing the level of support that's being provided? It's quite clear that with just half a member of the armed forces per English secondary school, that level of support is quite meagre.
What we're providing in terms of school is the resources in order to be able to deliver the testing programme themselves. We would only look at providing armed forces personnel in the most exceptional circumstances where a school, for whatever reason, is incapable of or not able to set up a testing regime. We've given them the extra time as well as the £78 million in order for all secondary schools to be able to establish this and set it up. But in those exceptional circumstances, we do have teams, as I say, supported by the Armed Forces and Ofsted as well as Department for Education in order to get these established, get them up and running and support those schools so every secondary school can have that mass testing regime.
Thank you. In order to allow the safe exit of honourable members participating in this item of business and the safe arrival of those participating in the next item of business, I will now suspend the House for 3 minutes. Order!